Well, welcome back to the channel. I am continuing with the sectoral balance, which I believe is chapter 6 of the macroeconomic textbook, written and authored by L. Randall Wray, I believe Martin Watts, and I believe it's Bill Mitchell or William Mitchell, all of which are economists in their own fields and in their own countries. Anyway, so let's see. We are on page 86. How can we use the sectorial balance framework? Question mark. The UK sectorial balance shown in figure 6.1, which you see here, replicates equation 6.5, except that the balances are expressed as percentage shares of GDP, gross domestic product. Note that the balances sum to zero. At this stage, 3 observations are appropriate. 1. Despite the contemporary rhetoric about the desirability of getting back to running an annual fiscal surplus, the UK has rarely done so. Indeed, only 7 fiscal surpluses have been achieved since 1960, each relatively small and short-lived. This is common for other developed nations too. 2. Like a number of other developed economies, including the US and Australia, current account surpluses have also been relatively rare. Number 3. Private sector balances have typically been in surplus. The limited occurrences of private sector deficits have been accompanied by fiscal surpluses. The 3 annual fiscal surpluses between 1998 and 2000, shown in figure 6.1, were accompanied by current account deficits and relatively large private sector deficits. 7.3% of GDP in 2000. The 2001 economic slowdown followed. In most advanced economies, sharp, severe economic downturns typically follow a period when fiscal surpluses are accompanied by large private sector deficits. I'm going to move this over a little bit so you can kind of see a little bit of the other one. There we go. Still kind of Jimmy right here, or gerrymandered, whatever the heck you want to call it. I don't know. Anyway. A graphical framework for understanding the sectoral balances. From equation 6.5, which you'll see below, we learned that the sum of the sectoral balances is 0 as a matter of accounting. We can construct a diagram defining 4 quadrants, in figure 6.2, depicts the government fiscal balances on the vertical axis and the external balances on the horizontal axis. Thus, all points above 0 on the vertical axis represents a government fiscal surplus, or T is greater than G, which I think is taxes is greater than government spending. And all points, all points to the right of the origin on the horizontal axis denote external surpluses. X plus F and I is greater than M. And all points to the left of the origin on the horizontal axis represents external deficits, or X plus F and I is lower than M. while we shall refer to surpluses and deficits with respect to the sectoral balances, these balances should be understood as being expressed as shares of GDP. Now let's see, I believe this is the axis right here. You don't really see it, so I can fix that. Yeah, kind of, there we go, kind of. Anyway, so let's see. Okay, yeah. Clearly, the origin of both axes denotes a position where all balances are equal to 0. From equation 6.5, we also know that when the private domestic balance is 0, or S equals I, then the government fiscal deficits or surplus will equal the external deficits or deficit surplus. From 6.2, the diagonal 45-degree line thus shows all combinations of government fiscal balances and external balances where the private domestic balance is 0. We will refer to this line. We will refer to this as the SI line. I think it's called a savings and investment line. We can use that knowledge, there we go, to determine the segments of the diagram where the private domestic balance is in surplus, or S is greater than I, and in deficit, which is S is lower than I. The investment is greater than savings, some to that effect. To make it easier, we will use equation 6.4 rewritten to this way. Now again, I'm not very good at math in terms of these kind of things, so that's why I usually just kind of read them. So there you go. S minus I equals G minus T plus X equals or minus M plus Fni, which I guess equals to G minus T plus CAB, which is I forgot what the heck that stands for, but anyway, where GNP minus C minus T minus S and CAB. I think that's consumer account balance right there. Anyway, equals X to the M plus Fni. This isolates the private domestic balance on the left-hand side. We need to identify combinations of the fiscal and external sector balances which yield a private domestic surplus or deficit at points A and C in figure 6.3. There is a private domestic balance. Point B corresponds to, let's just see this one more time. You can't see the whole thing, but anyway. Okay. Fiscal deficit G is greater than T, and an external surplus, or CAB, is greater than 0. Thus, the private sector must be engaging in positive net saving. S is greater than I. Then between points B and A, also B and C, net savings by private sector is falling until private domestic balance is achieved at points A and C respectively. Similarly, it can be readily shown at D, and the private domestic sector is net spending, or S is lower than I, between points D and C and D and A. And A, not NA, but and A. Not net spending by the private sector declines until private domestic balance is achieved at points A and C respectively. We can generalize this knowledge and conclude that all points above the 45-degree line on each side of the vertical axis corresponds to the private domestic sector deficits, and all points below the 45-degree line on each side of the vertical axis correspond to private domestic sector surpluses. Consider point B, for example, which corresponds to a private domestic surplus, whereas points A and C correspond to a private domestic balance. The graphical framework thus allows us to examine the implications of different policy options for a sovereign currency issuing government. All combinations of the sector balances represented by the points in the four quadrants are permissible, with private sector spending and saving decisions combining with the flows of income arising from trade with the external sector driving national income. The government sector can allow its balance to adjust to whatever magnitude is required to maintain full employment and price stability. For example, if the external account is in deficit and the private domestic sector is saving overall, then the drain on aggregate demand would require the government to run a deficit of sufficient size to ensure that total spending is sufficient to absorb the real productive capacity available in the economy. Now I'll give you a couple of seconds to look at this and see if it matches what I've been saying, or reading anyway. If anything, you could pause it and look over it. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. Alternatively, let me move this a little bit. Alternatively, the external account might be in surplus, which would add to the aggregate demand, while the private domestic sector might be spending more than it is earning. That is, in deficit overall. In these situations, the government would have to ensure it ran a surplus of sufficient size to ensure that the economy did not overheat and exhaust its productive capacity. The strong economy would be associated with robust tax revenue growth, which would help the government achieve its surplus. Discretionary adjustment in spending and taxation rates might also be required. But while these combinations of sectoral balances are permissible, we know that the private domestic sector cannot sustain deficits permanently. This is because the flows of spending which deliver deficits must be funded, as we learned earlier when we considered stocks and flows. See also the discussion in section 6.4. Private domestic deficits ultimately manifest in an increasing stock of debt being held on the private domestic sector's balance sheet. This process of debt accumulation is limited because at some point the susceptibility of the balance sheet to cyclical movements, for example, rising unemployment, increases and the risk of default rises. In some historical instances, this process has collapsed after serious debt defaults occurred. For example, in the early months of the global financial crisis in 2007 and 8 and GFC. At other times, the private sector starts to reduce the precautionist, maybe, I don't know, anyway, of its balance sheet by reducing spending and increasing saving to bring the debt it is carrying down to a more sustainable level. This will slow economic growth unless it is matched by increased spending by the government or foreign sector. In the long term, the only sustainable position is for the private domestic sector to be in surplus. An economy can absorb deviations from that position but only for short periods. Figure 6.4 shows that we might define as the sustainable space available to governments that issue their own currency. Note that this excludes permanent private sector deficits which are unsustainable. And you can see a little bit of it, but not much. Let me see if I can move this. I tried. Anyway. yeah. On the last one, if you want to, you can pause and see as much as you can as far as that part goes. But anyway, let me move this. There we go. Okay, so now imagine that the government is focused to operate under a fiscal role that bans fiscal deficits greater than 3%. I think this might be the gold standard, as shown in figure 6.5, which is actually below. By the black line, the formation of the European Economic and Monetary Union, or Eurozone, introduced just such a fiscal rule under its Stability and Growth Pact. The aim was to restrict the capacity of each member state to run government fiscal deficits. Now, it's important that you look at the term state, because as we know in the United States, states are users of the currency that the federal government, Congress, spends new created money into the economy. States thrive on that through contracts and various other means. Basically, any member of the EU is basically the equivalent of Ohio in the United States. Anyway, so let's see. What does such fiscal rule mean for both permissible and sustainable spaces are available to a macroeconomic policymaker? Clearly, any point above the 3% GDP fiscal deficit line in figure 6.5 is permissible. However, using the same logic as before, the sustainable space requires that the private domestic sector be in surplus overall, even though short-term deviations from this can occur from time to time. 6.5 shows this sustainable space for such an economy, the combination of gray and blue area. The blue shaded area shows the sustainable space available to policymakers in nations that run external surpluses. The gray shaded area shows the sustainable space available in policymakers in nations that run external deficits. Thus, the policy space the governments have to operate within when fiscal rules are imposed is very limited relative to the options available to a sovereign currency issuing government operating without any direct quantitative restrictions on the deficits they can run, as in U.S. Congress and U.S. government overall, period. Why is this important? An unconstrained government can always utilize the available space to ensure aggregate demand is sufficient to maintain full employment and price stability. By definition, not every nation can run an external surplus because an external surplus in one nation has to be matched by external deficit. In other nations, while the external surplus nations have more policy flexibility when operating under a fiscal rule at the type shown is 6.5. The fact remains that the allowable fiscal deficits may be insufficient to maintain the aggregate demand necessary to sustain full employment. The policy flexibility facing nations which run external deficits and simultaneously have to operate under fiscal rules become even more restrictive, as shown in figure 6.5 by the small gray triangle. When such an economy experiences a negative economic shock significant enough to drive the private sector to reduce its spending and target a sectorial surplus, the extent to which the fiscal deficit can be used to absorb the loss of overall aggregate demand is very limited. It is highly likely that such an economy will experience enduring recessions as a result of the artificial fiscal rules or restrictions that are placed on its government. Note that such a situation befell Greece and some other Mediterranean European nations that the GFC impacted. Note that figure 6.2 to 6.5 show the feasible combinations of sectoral balances under the constraint and unconstrained scenarios, but do not show which combinations are associated with full employment. Reminder box. The sustainable goal for a government should be to maintain full employment and price stability and allow its fiscal balance to adjust accordingly to ensure aggregate demand is consistent with those goals. A sovereign currency issuing government can always meet those goals if it chooses. Important term right there, chooses. However, the imposition of fiscal rules restrict the government from achieving these goals and makes a predetermined fiscal outcome the target of macroeconomic policy rather than the more significant macroeconomic objectives of full employment and price stability. The lesson here is that the government should never specifically target any particular fiscal outcome, but rather should target employment growth and price level stability. Now, next week, I will be going with the revisiting stocks and flows. But until then, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you guys got some education out of it. If you have any questions, please feel free to put down in the comments section. Like, subscribe, donate to realprogressives.org. And thank you for those who did donate to the past year-end fundraiser for Real Progressives. Is much appreciated. But if you want to, at some point, donate or continuously donate, you can always go to realprogressives.org and go hit the donation button and go for either monthly, weekly, yearly, whatever the case may be. So thank you again for doing that. Also, you can check them out at Macro and Cheese podcast every Saturday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern. And also, if you miss it, or if you want to be involved in like a group type setting, then ask questions and whatnots. then you can register for Macro and Chill that happens on Tuesday. Yeah, Tuesday, 8 p.m. Eastern. Either way, go to realprogressives.org for more information about that. See, was there anything else? You can check them out on TikTok, on Facebook, Twitter. I'm going to call it Twitter either way. It's not X. That brings up too many things right there. But Twitter, again, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, as I said, the website, and also check out MoslerEconomics.com. There, Warren Mosler, who is one of the founding fathers of the concept of MMT, which is just a description of what what a sovereign currency issuing government can do with no outside debt and a floating exchange rate can do, pretty much. Anyway, so on there, all of his books are free to download and read. I may be starting to read one of them here pretty soon. Not quite sure yet, but anyway. And you can also check me out on my Substack, calvintaylor.substack.com. I'll be uploading some later on today, hopefully anyway. And I discuss pretty much whatever's on my mind at that time that's macroeconomic. And I would suggest that you look out for what's going on in Argentina, as it looks like they're trying to replace their peso with the USD. So that's pretty much libertarian, because the president there is a libertarian economist. So that should be fun. We'll see what happens there. I don't see it ending well, but who knows? I could be wrong in terms of that. Anyways, you guys have a good day. I hope you guys had a good holiday, and peace out for now.